Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Very good to see so many of you here, both in the room and also online. This roundtable has been organized by the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies, who generously hosted us here today. So many people signed up for the seminars, we couldn't fit it into our normal conference room at the Department of Political Science. That's why we moved here. It has also been organized in collaboration with the Mistra Mineral Governance program and the GRIP ARN project and the EPPLE group at Stockholm University. And we have a very interesting program today. We will focus on an extremely timely topic related to the race for critical raw material needed for the low carbon transition. There is a lot of geopolitical interest and concerns about the influential role of China. And at the same time, we see that some of the largest reserves of minerals are located in countries in the global south, where we have fragile states and poor governance conditions and corruption. There are already clear examples that the intensified extractions will have negative social and environmental impacts and leads to conflicts over land and water in producing sites. And against this background, there are new political discourses emerging around so-called sustainable extraction, wherein policymakers and corporations argue that intensified extraction can be made sustainable. And we can see, for example, at the EU level, new policies have been adopted that seeks to increase extraction in Europe, fostering more recycling and to reduce the social and environmental impacts of mining. And at the same time, we can see that there is a rising critique of, for example, the CRM Act, that this way of trying to sort of fast track strategic projects, simplifying license procedures, and lowering environmental standards can potentially have very negative impacts in producing countries. An important question is therefore to what extent conflicting goals regarding the need to increase extraction, but at the same time make sure that extractive industries are sustainable and minimalizing the social environmental impacts are compatible. I'm delighted to have the honor today to moderating a panel with so distinguished researchers. And the idea is that we should encourage all of you to think together and critically and constructively how we can sort of address these contradictions as the heart of the low carbon transition, how they could be handled. And we have 5 panelists here today, and each of them bringing different perspectives and expertise from different parts of the world. And each will have first 8 minutes to introduce their insights and reflections on a couple of key questions that related to CRM governance. And I will, shortly, I will just briefly introduce each of them. But first, I would just like to say a few words of the key guiding questions that we will address during the seminar. So David, if you could just change the slide, please. Can I change? Okay. Okay. Rasmus, yeah, okay. There you go. Ah, yeah, okay, thanks.
She has it now.
Okay, oh, whatever. Okay, I will read the question instead. So the 4 questions that will guide our seminar today and the different presentation is first, what is the current state of governance for critical raw material? To what extent and in what ways are human rights and environmental standards being integrated into the governance of critical raw materials? And what are the bottom-up and alternative governance solutions for handling trade-offs between extraction and sustainability? And what challenges and opportunities arise from political and institutional conditions in enhancing sustainable governance of critical raw materials? And the panelists, they have been invited or encouraged to answer their reflections in 1 or 2 of these overarching questions. And after their introductory speeches, we will conclude with a 10 minutes discussion where I will ask each of them to step back a little bit and reflect on where their hopes and fear for CRM governance are. And then we will give the audience time to ask questions. And if you would like to ask questions during the presentations, for those who participate online, you could just post them in the Q&A chat, and we will try to come back to them in the discussion. And I would also just like to say that we will also during the session take photos that will be shared on Stockholm University's and Stockholm Environmental Institute's website. And if you do not want to appear in those photos, please inform Sylvia, who is there back in the room after the seminar, and we will make sure to not publish any photo with you. Yeah, so let's get started. First, we have Erika Weinthal. She's a distinguished professor from Duke University, and she's an expert on global environmental politics, environmental security, and extractive governance. And today, Erika will provide us with a broad overview of crucial issues surrounding extractive governance and helping us to set up the stage for the discussions ahead. So welcome, Erika.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, and thank you to Stockholm University, all the institutes that were listed for hosting this event today on, I'm going to go over here a little bit, on governing critical raw materials in energy transitions. And I am going to speak very broadly to sort of introduce some of the bigger issues that I think about, but also I think the larger community thinks about when we think about how to govern critical minerals. Let's see. This is sort of tricky. Do I need to stand here?
Yes.
Okay. My eyes aren't so good.
Choose one of these?
No, because but where do I need to stand?
If you want, you can take the microphone.
Okay, and then I can just stand here? Okay, that makes it easier so I can see the slides. So I'm referencing what I'm supposed to be talking about. Okay, so I want to start with why we're focusing on critical minerals at this event today. And as we all know, critical minerals are important for the global green transition as we move away from our fossil fuel dependence, and also for countries to meet their global greenhouse gas commitments, to meet commitments under the Paris Agreement. And to do that means we need to shift away from the use of oil and gas, coal, towards more renewable sources of energy, and think about, wind energy, solar, and also the need for, different types of transportation, such as electric vehicles. When we talk about critical minerals, often we're also countries in particular are thinking about their security concerns, and we're going to hear a lot about that on how they source critical minerals. And the EU, the United States, has their own critical minerals list. Sometimes they align on certain critical minerals, other times they don't. But this is really about, their energy independence in a new way, versus others who are thinking about many of the negative impacts of mining for critical minerals that are tied to mitigating some of the environmental, social, and governance impacts. What makes critical minerals a little different than fossil fuels? Their supply chains are much more elongated. There's much more distancing from where critical minerals are produced and where they end up, that they go through different countries and different producers. And so we also have to think about traceability, the transparency, and trying to figure out those supply chains and the sustainability of supply chains. Put this over here. Okay. Just when you take lithium as one source, lithium brines, they are spread out across the world, and they're not in the traditional places where we find fossil fuels. So when we think about oil and gas, we often think about a certain set of countries. We think about the Gulf, we think about Nigeria, Venezuela, Canada. But when it comes to lithium brines, in particular, many of them are located in South America. And so we're talking about a different set of producing countries than we talk about when we talk about fossil fuels. And I've been working with my colleague, Catherine Lederber, who's here in the Salar de Uyuni, just to point that out, in Bolivia recently, which has some of the largest global reserves of lithium brines. When we look at mining or the extractive industries generally, we know it is very dirty. There is a long legacy of pollution, contamination, especially from oil and gas production that we've seen in places like Nigeria. And, you know, the question that will arise as there is a greater need for critical minerals is whether this will also be a dirty industry, whether the green transition is actually a clean transition or a dirty transition as we move towards more renewables. Many of these critical minerals have also been linked to conflict in the past. So not all of them have, you know, are seen as, you know, green in many ways because they have this long history of being tied to conflict minerals or the resource curse. What I think is really important and what I want to talk about is just sort of highlighting what we know from the extractives already, because this should give us some caution as we start thinking about the green transition and not go into the green transition as this is going to be easy and mining for, you know, critical minerals for the green transition will be clear and clean. We also need to pay attention to a wide range of actors that are going to be involved. And, you know, it ranges across, you know, there's a whole new set of actors that are involved, but there are many that are state-owned enterprises that have had a long history of, you know, pollution, contamination in the oil and gas industry. There's foreign and private companies, the same. Local communities are involved in many ways, and also national governments. And then there's all the international organizations too, and NGOs that are involved in governance. From governing the extractive industries, there are a few lessons that we've learned already, that transparency matters, especially when it comes to contracts, accountability and oversight. There is a need for citizen involvement, especially if you want to fight corruption, which has been something that has been prevalent in the oil and gas industry. And you need citizen involvement also to manage public expectations, because often there is this expectation that everyone will benefit from the extractive industries, and same with critical minerals, like lithium. You need to invest in the communities where extraction is taking place. You need to, again, understand the entire supply chain, but there's also limits to the use of different private voluntary governance mechanisms, such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I'll just say a few words about that in a second, but this has been the main initiative for the oil and gas sector to fight corruption from the revenue that is generated from oil and gas based on this disclosure of revenue. But at times, you've had countries that have failed to adhere to the governance mechanisms because this is all voluntary. And so there is no one that can really you know, mandate transparency. It really depends on companies that are willing to disclose their contracts. Okay. I am going to move through this very fast. Okay, we've seen an uptick, though, in disclosure of contracts, and this will be very important with contracts for lithium, for example. Publish What You Pay is working on what is called Disclose the Deal. So to also make the transition minerals also publicly available, the contracts. Countries have been doing this for quite some time, trying to regulate the extractive industries. The United States has a Dodd-Frank Act that was focused on conflict minerals. The International Energy Agency has been tracking policies and legislation related to critical minerals. And we're seeing more and more of these policies emerge on how to govern these supply chains. We're seeing what was mentioned previously in the EU. There's different pieces of legislation, the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, the EU Battery Regulation, all to work on, you know, having a safe, sustainable value chain. The United States is a little bit lagging, but we've had the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. There's movement towards a global strategy for securing critical minerals. But again, this is focused on the security aspect, not the sustainability aspect. And I'm just going to conclude with most of what's happening has been happening at the state level about security, but there's also this need to focus on the stakeholders and the communities. And this is either through human rights approaches, impact and benefit agreements, free and prior informed consent, listening to the communities where the extraction is taking place. And my last slide is just one could look at Bolivia, which we will talk about in our paper tomorrow, and the role of public consultation that is built into the Constitution in Bolivia, and also having a very strong civil society that plays a role in, based in its negotiations with companies or as part of, the institutional structure in Bolivia. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Erika, for this insightful overview over the extractive governance landscape. Now we will continue on this important topic, and I'm pleased to introduce Susan Parks, who is Professor of Global Governance in International Relations in the University of Sydney. And Susan has made extensive, significant contribution on the work on international organizations and global governance and how to make it more environmentally and sustainable and accountable. And today she will continue to introduce us to the emerging transnational governance architecture of renewable energies.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to make 3 comments about critical minerals and materials governance. The first one is that it's noticeably not dominated by international energy organizations. The second point is that voluntary transnational governance has proliferated with a multitude of ESG initiatives, but there remain what we call significant governance gaps. And the third point is that there is little in the way of accountability in these initiatives for holding actors to account for their environmental and social impact. So to this first point, mining, as we know, is largely governed domestically through leasing mining concessions, production quotas, enforcing private property, human rights and environmental laws. But there is a dominance of multinational mining corporations. There's weak state enforcement capacity. There are global supply chains, as we've just heard, and there is global demand. All of this highlights the importance of investigating transnational governance and global governance to mitigate the worst aspects of critical minerals mining. So this would lead us to think that international energy agencies would be the place for governance. Notably, however, the International Energy Agency and IRENA provide little role in providing socio-ecological protections for people and ecosystems. And that's because these international organizations really aim to promote energy cooperation and access. This is primarily what they are for. And this is important because, as we know, there are quite significant environmental impacts. We're talking about water, we're talking about biodiversity, hazardous waste, impacts on human health. There goes my earring. Somehow knew that was going to happen. Didn't expect it right now, though. Land disputes and, of course, Indigenous people's rights and cultural heritage. So there are quite significant impacts. But we can point to 2 international organisations or supranational institutions that are having an important leading role. And that, of course, is the European Union and the OECD. So the European Union has a number of directives. Erika's already mentioned them, while the OECD has a number of standards specifically for mining in relation to child labour, conflict-affected areas and meaningful stakeholder engagement in global supply chains. But of course, as we know, OECD standards are voluntary. And this comes to the second point I want to make, and that's that there are significant governance gaps in trying to regulate or oversee critical minerals mining. And what my co-authors and I did was to establish a database of transnational governance initiatives that have proliferated pretty much since 2010, more significantly since 2016 in relation to battery minerals. So we identified 44 initiatives that explicitly refer to minerals mining and had some form of government protection and human rights aims. This sort of is not included in the number of more broader human rights initiatives like the UN human rights guidelines. So the types of initiatives that we've identified have some form of environmental protection and human rights aims. So we can talk about the Copper Mark, which was created only in 2020, the Responsible Cobalt Initiative, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. These are, at least 1/3 of these are driven by IOs like the European Union and by the OECD. Another third of them are private sector driven, indicating that the private sector has established their own voluntary initiatives to regulate their own behaviour. And the final third are a mixture of public and private and NGO initiatives, and a small number are fully multi-stakeholder initiatives like the EITI that Erika has already mentioned, and since 2020, the Global Tailings Review. So what we found really interesting in undertaking this exercise was that there are significant governance gaps. This is an absence of rules for many critical minerals. Only 16 of the 44 initiatives that we identified cover all minerals and metals. These are comprehensive initiatives, while the remaining initiatives tend to concentrate on just a single mineral, such as cobalt. This means that there are many critical minerals that are under or entirely unregulated. The initiatives themselves tend to cover a whole gamut of environmental or social concerns. It's a real pick and mix, if you like, with companies choosing what they choose to hold themselves accountable for. This covers things like reducing CO2 emissions, good governance, broad discussions about health or human rights, and child labour. Notably absent across these initiatives are for governing water and Indigenous rights protections. Further research, of course, is necessary to identify why some impacts are included and others are not. The final point I want to make is about what we are calling accountability traps. This is where these actors, either individually or collectively, are creating governance initiatives, and they seek to hold themselves to account for what they themselves choose. So this means that corporations, for example, can hold themselves to certain standards for certain processes that they themselves have created. So this means that they can demonstrate that they have been held accountable, but only for what they themselves have chosen. So we see very, very few regulations in our database. Most of these are completely voluntary initiatives. We have looked at the types of activities that these initiatives aim to undertake. Most of them overwhelmingly provide information. So this is a really low bar in terms of governance. But of course, it could lead to something stronger. A lot of the governance initiatives that we've identified tend to focus on certification systems. So this is giving us an idea of how the private sector is seeking to govern itself. Half of the governance initiatives are based on followers agreeing to voluntarily undertake internal activities and to establish their own standards. So again, this is really the private sector choosing what it itself wants to do. As a result, there are very, very few measures to enforce compliance across these initiatives. 41% provide no evidence of any form of any type of sanctioning for failing to meet expected performance. 21% rely on naming and shaming for failing to meet certification standards. 14% make a vague reference to the possibility of future sanctions. What we can see, therefore, is that these are neither compulsory nor guaranteed. Current initiatives are not designed in any way to measure evaluate, and sanction the governance outcomes. And these are primarily towards supply chain security and energy access. This is not about mitigating the environmental and social harms of resource extraction. So we're starting to see the emergence of transnational governance architecture that operates primarily and perhaps systematically with minimal scrutiny or accountability. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Susan, for highlighting these important limitations and accountability gaps in the existing transnational initiatives. Now let's move to our next speaker, Hyeyoon Park. And Dr. Park, she's a lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling in the UK, where her research focuses on global environmental politics and governance. And she has made specifically important contributions to the understanding of China's role in transnational governance of mineral resource extraction. And today she will reflect upon the existing global governance of critical raw material in the context of geopolitical tension. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you today. My name is Hyeyoon Park, and I'm going to kind of deliver my kind of observations based on what I have worked on for past few years. So I mostly focus on transnational level governance, how to mitigate the negative environmental harms and social harms related to critical mineral extractions, and specifically look at the role of China in this global governance realm. So first of all, I want to share my observation about the current status of the global governance related to critical minerals. So I think that there are two major characteristics. So one is quite an overlap with what Erika and Susan already mentioned. So I also could have observed a lot of complexity in this regime architecture. So now we see that a lot of diverse types of actors are engaging in this realm. So of course, state actors, non-state actors, private corporation, of course, and civil society actors. Not surprising, but at the same time, on different levels of governance, we can observe like from the global level, international organizations are engaging at the same time, also regional level, domestic level, also local level, right? But also I can see also very different dynamics as well across policy issue areas. So before when I started like studying this issue, I felt like, is it really climate change issue? There was like one of the question I raised like when I was PhD students. But now I could observe that the UNFCCC Climate Summit adopted this issue and then really facilitated this issue in the governance area of climate change. So that is quite a fascinating new dynamics. And then the speed of the emerging the new institutions is so rapid. So just during the past 5 years, I was so busy to catch up what new institutions were set up. So, when I just sleep and then woke up and then I just saw the new institutions. So it was really hard to catch up the trajectory. But I think that I can see the good side and the bad side. So first of all, of course, like this new trend really made international society pay more attention to this topic. This is absolutely a very critical and crucial topic we have to kind of handle. So in that sense, I think this is very good trend and trajectory. But at the same time, I'm very worried about the accountability issue. So I think this Susan really kind of made a great comment and observation about that part. So mostly these governance institutions are voluntary-based systems. So of course, there is no enforcement mechanism. So that brings a lot of greenwashing and whitewashing problems because there is no centralized authority to enforce their implementation. So the problem is like how we can really enforce and make private corporations behavior really in a responsible way. So I can see that like we need to find synergistic like solutions between existing governance mechanisms. So global governance standards cannot like work just alone without strong, stringent domestic mining law, for instance, because that brings also litigation risk imposed to business actors, right? So business actors are afraid of being sued, right? And also they are afraid of investors. So when we kind of set up very nice green investment index, for instance, that can be also a tool to enforce their implementations. And then I think as a second kind of very primary emerging characteristic in this governance realm is geopolitical story. So this story became securitized. So of course, because of the US and China rivalries and great power competitions, even though we are all kind of interested in sustainability issue, we now also need to talk about security contexts. And of course, the US kind of initiated mineral security partnerships. Through these initiatives, the US kind of emphasized both ESG sustainability norms at the same time national security norms. How can we reconcile these like very opposing, looking like very opposing norms and values? That can be very very important questions. The problem is like these also seem to be an effort of decoupling China in this global governance efforts. It's not only decoupling China from global supply chains of critical minerals, but also like a little bit like, making Chinese actors isolated from global governance. So in that sense, I'm a little bit worrying about this part. So I see that these geopolitical tensions as the biggest challenge in this current global mineral governance structures. Because, we cannot really kind of ignore Chinese actors' impact in this scenes. China is the biggest mineral supplier, also consumers, even though the many countries try to impose sanctions to China, but still the cooperation between China and the other global South states remain largely, and they are growing at the same time. For instance, like in Indonesia, in the Sulawesi region, there is a big, gigantic the mining complex industry area for nickel mining. And then that area is really occupied by Chinese actors. And then China sent more than like 6,000 Chinese workers in that region. So we definitely cannot ignore the huge impact of China. But the problem is like how we can make them, behave in a responsible way. So in that sense, I think we still need to try to engage Chinese actors in this global governance mechanisms. Based on my kind of previous research, I observed that still, there is hope. So more than 100 Chinese private companies are started engaging in existing kind of standards mechanisms. But of course, we can also raise a concern whether they actually really behave following that standards. That is a second question. But still, I could have observed that based on one of the recent kind of study that I've done with Rafael de Barton and Jessica Di Carlo, that Chinese actors started learning the importance of this ESG standards. So it's really as a step-by-step approach, they became really socialized. And they need a little bit of time. But I'm just worried that because of the current geopolitical situation really kind of may burn the bridge of any opportunities to keep kind of collaborating with the Chinese actors as well. So in that sense, I see a hope as well from the newly established kind of institutions led by the UN Secretary General called the UN Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals. So obviously the UN declared that this institution is really for global equity and just transition for all. So not excluding any actors, any countries. So that's why this kind of panel tried to invite both US actors, also Chinese actors. So I see this as quite a kind of optimistic opportunities to kind of build up a new collaboration chances in this very hawkish geopolitical environment. So I hope that this will work and diversify the members of the participation in the current global governance, mineral resource governance architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for excellent timekeeping and very important insights. So now shifting to from the global and transnational scene, more to the national perspective. The next speaker is Assistant Professor Scot Odell. And Scott, he leads the program on mining and circular economy at MIT, Environmental Solution Initiatives. And he has done extensive research in Chile, and he will share some of his insights from that research with us today.
Thank you, Maria-Therese. Thanks for that introduction. One clarification is I'm a program scientist, not assistant professor, but thank you for that. I would like that position. Let's add that. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I have to say, as a person who focuses on Latin America, especially being in this library, a library focused on Latin America, it's very exciting. So thank you for hosting us today. I'm going to focus my remarks on questions 3 and 4 that Maria-Therese presented. As a refresher, question 3 was about the grassroots perspective of these governance challenges. And as Maria-Therese mentioned as well, I'm bringing sort of a national case focus. I focus my research in Chile, in large part because Chile is such an important mining country and in some ways is representative of a lot of the challenges that other mining countries are going to be facing. Chile is by far the world's largest producer of copper. We've had some disagreement already today about their lithium production, but they produce a lot of lithium too. Second largest. There's a Chile-Bolivia thing going on here. But they produce a lot of lithium as well. So regardless of the trajectory that we will see moving forward with clean energy transition minerals, Chile is going to be an important part of that. I focus my research in 3 mining regions of Chile, large-scale copper mining operations, looking at conflict over water in these regions between local agricultural communities and the mining companies. The copper and lithium in Chile is concentrated in and around the Atacama Desert, the world's driest desert. And some of the copper is also in the central region of the country, which has experienced an unprecedented mega drought since 2010 due to climate change. So because of the large impact of mining on water, there's been a lot of conflict over this issue, and especially with local farmers who are concerned about the integrity of their water supplies. So one point that I want to share from my research is that communities have become empowered to protect their resources, their water resources, land resources in general. And some of this has been through traditional means that we might expect: protests, road blockades, a hunger strike. And some of it has come through legal battles, through bringing legal cases against mining companies, in some cases successfully, and in some cases just drawing attention to the issues at hand. And then lastly, I've also seen, even in just the last few years, a big expansion in training and expertise among communities, including indigenous communities in the far north region, who developed expertise in hydrology so that they can measure their own water supplies and be able to bring that expertise to bear in legal proceedings, for example. So these mining communities have become empowered. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, mining companies have been forced to or decided to take those concerns more seriously than in the past. And in the case of Chile, that's through 2 main means. One is through what's termed collaboration, working more with the communities to try and understand the perspective, what they're concerned about, rather than just a traditional corporate social responsibility action of, say, building a stadium. We're sorry we ruined your water supply, but we'll build a stadium. There's a recognition that that's not sufficient. We need to actually solve the water concern communities worry about. On the other, another practice that mining companies are now pursuing, in some cases at the request of communities, is to develop desalination plants all along the coast of northern Chile so that the mining companies can get their water from the ocean. In some cases, replacing some of the resources they would have traditionally used from continental water supply. And these are a really important development and a response to community concerns. But the concern that I raised through my research is the potential for additional environmental injustices because the way in which these responses tend to emerge favors more powerful communities and tends to favor upstream communities as well, those communities nearest the mines. So as an example of this, last year, I visited an encampment of artisanal fishermen who had been blocking the construction of a desalination plant for 3 months because they were worried about the impacts of that plant on their fishing grounds. The water from that plant was intended to be sent to the Bronces copper mine at high elevations, 3,000 meters above sea level. Eventually, that camp was cleared by police. Eventually, the fishermen reached an agreement with the desalination company. But the point that I observed from that is that here's one community concerned that the problems of the highlands, the problems nearest the mine, may simply be displaced and solved somewhere else. In other words, if we don't solve the actual root of the problem, maybe over extraction of water supplies, or that there's just higher demand for copper that's going to affect water supplies, we may displace those harms elsewhere. Now, again, on the other hand, some coastal communities have said, we want some of that desalinated water too. They're also in drought. So there are opportunities here for mining companies also in this process to contribute to some needs in coastal areas. So that's my comment on question 3. The other comment I want to make, and this is much broader, this is situating what I observe in Chile within the broader national and global political economic context. And that's with regard to Maria-Therese's 4th question, which you may remember is about challenges and opportunities. 2 minutes? Okay, I'll be fast. At this big global political economic level, I see 3 main challenges and opportunities. Challenge/opportunity, they're both. The first is that if we're going to do more mining, we need to do mining better. We have a long record, as everyone who's spoken so far has noted, of mining really having severe social and environmental impacts. And I'd point specifically to we need to do community relations better, we need to do tailings better, and we need to do mine closure better. The second challenge/opportunity is advancement of the circular economy. So we need to find ways to replace our demand for virgin material with recycled material. And that requires a lot of processes. It requires innovation in the recycling industry. It also requires making it easier for consumers and industry to return their materials to enter that circular stream. And then lastly, and this may be the hardest one, is that we need to find ways to mitigate that demand, both for energy and for metals. So we are right now in a position where it seems to me we're just trying to do everything the same way we've always done it, but with different energy resources. And that's going to come now from metal. And if anything, we're dramatically increasing demand for energy for things like artificial intelligence. We need instead to recognize this is an opportunity to rethink the way our society functions, our consumption and our production. Coming from the United States, a prime example of this for me is we're investing a lot of our public resources in recreating an individual car infrastructure again, based on EVs, but we're still locking in that individual automobile infrastructure instead of investing in public transportation, bikeable and walkable cities, or at least maybe not instead of, we're doing that a little bit, but not as much as we could be doing with those resources. I will pause there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Scott. So now to our last but not least speaker, I will welcome Rasmus Kløcker Larsen. He's a research fellow, senior research fellow, and team lead at the Rights and Equity team at Stockholm Environmental Institute. And I think you are an associate professor. No, at Uppsala. I think so. And Rasmus, he will provide a bottom-up perspective drawn on his extensive research in the Sami homeland in Sweden.
Thanks, Maria-Therese. Do you hear me okay? the pleasure listening to you all, learning a lot, and having international guests coming to Stockholm, my home city. I'll talk a little bit about some experiences from the northern Sweden. So to use Scott's words, the Swedish case, if you like. And of course, there's several reasons why that's relevant in this context. One is that Sweden is one of the largest mineral providers within the European Union and hope to be so in the future. And certainly the national government also has expectations in that regard. Sweden also is proud itself of high performance when it comes to human rights protection and environmental standards. And we have in my team, there's several people working in close collaboration with Sami organizations, Swedish government organizations, specifically on land use conflicts and mineral extraction. So as you might or might not be aware, the Sami is, as far as I know, the only indigenous people recognized in the European Union. And often people are come into contact with the Sami through tourists or through cultural artifact literature and movies. Sweden also hosts a huge expand of reindeer herding territory. So about 50% of the territory on land is used by Sami reindeer herding, which is one of the traditional livelihoods together with fishing and hunting. Sami reindeer herding is organized in so-called herding districts or communities, which are associations of reindeer herders who exercise semi-nomadic herding, often from the sea to the mountains towards or into Norway. Less variation in the land use, but it requires vast extent of land, and thus the land use conflicts often precipitate in relation to various kinds of infrastructure, and mineral extraction is, of course, one. So I thought I would try and make 3 points, broadly covering or addressing the questions raised by Maria-Therese. The first one is that, as someone said, mineral governance is taking place nationally. So it's important to understand what is the domestic regime. And in Sweden, the domestic regulations on mining is known. A lot of research has testified to that, and UN, European criticisms as well, to a very scant regard for Sami rights, lacking rights protection. It's a long series of complaints from the European and United Nations experts committees and legal bodies. And it also includes, of course, lack of protection for cultural rights, the lack of protection for property rights. And some of my colleagues have written an excellent piece, I think, on the multi-level governance gap. So there are gaps at multiple levels. So it's from the international obligations to the constitutional level in Sweden, but there are lesser mentioned in the constitution and in national level legislation. But then there's a gap from that legislation to the sectoral laws that actually govern licensing. So the European, the Mineral Code, Mineral Act, and the Environment Code has a lot of silences when it comes to rights protection, and that means that the desk officers who sit in the permitting authorities do not consider those obligations of the government. And then again, in the end, you have a gap when we reach the level of practice, actually enacting what is the protection that is in the sectoral laws when it comes to mining. That was the first point. The second point is about the response, and I think in many ways it relates to what Scott touched upon. I thought I would highlight 2 types of responses. One is what I think is a growing tendency to pursue negotiated agreements, impact benefit agreements. There was a recent example in August. LKAB signed an agreement, this was in the media, with a reindeer herding community about the Viscaria mine. And that was an outcome of a longer process of contestation process from the Sami community, but in the end, they opted to sign an agreement. And one can speculate whether that was entirely voluntary. We are not. We did a study, a paper, not on mining, but on wind power and other types of industrial developments, and found that we could actually renegotiate access to a set of these agreements together with Sami communities. So we were able to look at the documents, and often they're confidential, so it's not in the public domain. And we saw prevalence of provisions that we talk about as gag clauses, so meaning communities cannot protest there, so that they are constrained in their ability to exercise democratic rights, to access justice. And open consent clauses that actually often contracts are formulated in a way that communities consent, perhaps even to an extension of the project time-wise or not geographically. So there's a lot of problems with the way these contracts look today. Of course, we know internationally that they can be helpful tools, but one would have to look at how to improve that practice in Sweden, it seems. The third point and the last point is sort of trying to tie that to the international developments and European developments that our first speakers helpfully sort of provided that overview on. And I think, I mean, the impression so far is that, unfortunately, it seems that the Critical Raw Materials Act, for instance, from the European Union is rather silent when it comes to acknowledging these language conflicts. And lacks coherence with other developments like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And there's a real risk that even the latter, with the due diligence, the mandatory due diligence rules, will just overlay a set of less enforceable expectations on top of a very dysfunctional national licensing regime. So I guess an argument would be that unless you really address the national legislation and regulations, we might not see much progress. Of course, the due diligence directive, the mandatory due diligence rules provide for a civil liability regime. So one could hope that the use of courts might prompt some improvements, and we are certainly seeing reindeer herding communities and Sami organizations being much better equipped, much more able to exercise their rights and sue companies in different ways. So I mean, that could be one example of window of opportunity. But I think, yeah, we have to acknowledge that in the very core, there's this immense asymmetry when it comes to resources and power. And unless we address that, I don't think we'll work towards that much hoped for the green and just transition. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. This has definitely given us a lot of food for thought, and what you have described as a rather weak transnational governance architecture that is quite fragmented with significant accountability gaps, and also that leaves it's very difficult for local communities to navigate in this context. So now to start the discussion, I would like to ask the panelists two questions that will sort of help us to back a little bit and reflect upon the actual consequences of the emerging form of CRM governance. And these two questions, I would like you to respond to them very quickly, like to have 2 minutes maximum, one question, 1 minute for each question. And the first question is, what is your greatest hope for the impact of the emerging CRM governance landscapes? And what is your single biggest fear? So let's start with Rasmus, and then.
Sure, thanks. I just spoke, I don't know what else to add, but I can try. I think as was implied in what I tried to summarize, I think my biggest fear would be that we are just drinking, what do you say? Old wine on new bottles, and I think several of us spoke to that. That will be a brief answer to on the fear. In terms of hope, I mean, I guess I really like what you said, Scott, about communities being, I think you said, more empowered. I think that if we could see that this new demand for this transition fostering or enabling actors, whether market actors or government actors, who really want genuinely to do something different, that we can see a shift in the way resources are, economic resources and finances are being provided, that can sort of continue to promote that political mobilization at the grassroots level, because I think that's perhaps the key factor. Political mobilization of indigenous and local communities, that they can exercise their rights. If that will happen, then perhaps we could see some changes. But it doesn't look too promising at the moment.
I'll start with my fear and end so that I end on a positive note. My hope. A variation on the theme of what you just said, Rasmus, about old wine, new bottles. I like that metaphor. The variation I would add to that is my fear is that critical mineral mining for a clean energy transition will end up just being a discursive project to justify unsustainable mining and energy use. And that in turn will lead us to a new environmental crisis. We're doing it to justify solving the world's greatest environmental challenge, climate change, but in doing so, we may actually leave ourselves with a new global environmental crisis. On that happy note, my greatest hope is that we can instead use this as an opportunity to rethink the way we shape our consumption and production practices as a society and the way we distribute mineral wealth. And coming back to the case of Chile, if you are unfamiliar with Chile, Chile has just gone through a really major disruption since 2019 that started with protests over inequality, resulted in 2 proposed constitutions, both of which failed, but they were really, the first one especially, proposed some pretty dramatic changes to society. Those failed, but in the midst of that, the government did pass 2 important laws, one a water law and one a mineral royalty law that did a better job of distributing resources and protecting water rights. And then a new lithium law, which has some problems, but at least is showing the government has the capacity to do some planning in this regard. So I am optimistic, given that mining countries can rethink the way in which they are extracting and distributing their resources.
So I will also start with the fear part, if you don't mind. So definitely, as I mentioned before, I'm very worried about the current geopolitical tensions and great power politics between the US and China specifically, because that really kind of reinforce like a zero-sum game rationale. So like it really try to focus on more like a national interest instead of like focusing on just transitions and equity issues and sustainability issues. So, and also like that really kind of brings a crisis of multilateralism. So in that sense, I really worry about that. And I don't have a worry kind of picture, and especially as a South Korean from also like from the peninsula, divided peninsula, having very strong like a securitized context. So I know that how that rationale really kind of dominates all the other kind of spectrums and narratives. So in that sense, I'm very worried about that. And also another kind of fear is related to new colonialism. So that kind of great power competition can kind of bring a new histories and this era also like similar to the post-colonial histories, and also linked to carbon capitalism. So really serving some powerful market actors and also state actors in these narratives. But at the same time, I also have hope when I see the UN's new kind of initiatives, the UN panel on the critical transition mineral minerals that really kind of brings a more inclusive, collaborative kind of endeavor. So in that sense, I think I really appreciate the such leadership, but also like I just get hope from all the passionate people from international organizations, but also from the local level as well. So when I watch a documentary about like the women's movement, especially from indigenous communities in Indonesia, Africa, and Latin America, those people make me really feel humble, even though I study this as a researcher, but I feel like they are actually doing a very important job to cope with this issue. So I definitely want to find a way to empower those people and local communities, and want to think about like how we can be more creative to navigate this like uncertain era. But I have also hope regarding Stockholm. So very successful kind of historical events in the Stockholm Convention. So which is the most classical kind of global environmental corporations happen here during the Cold War era in 1968, right? So I think that can be a possibility that we can also imagine altogether.
Thank you very much. These are really good questions. The hope is that we have a just and sustainable transition, more regulations, more transparency, more accountability in order to provide all of the R's, the redesign of energy systems and use, a redesign of how we extract, what we extract, the reuse, the reduction of consumption, the recycling, there are more R's. These are the ones I can just think of off the top of my head. So that would be the hope. And it's good to be hopeful in Europe because Europe seems to be the leading light. I come from Australia where mining interests are entrenched. It is all considered too much, these expectations that we have. And so this brings me to the fear. The fear is that we will have neither a fast nor sustainable nor just transition. And this is what concerns me, that we have bad faith actors that are more than willing to take up these concerns we have about justice and about sustainability and use it against us in order to not transition. And so the biggest fear, I think, is that we won't have an orderly transition, that it will be disorderly and that more people will suffer.
I'm like, ooh, the doom and gloom. I don't even know where to go with that one.
Sorry.
Sorry, but I'm like, wow. Okay, I'll start with the fear so we can end with something hopeful because I just can't go down that path. I'm sorry. It's just like, and I don't know if I'll say it's a fear, but I'd say it's a concern. And I'm just going to throw in something to the conversation that we haven't talked about today. But, it ties into some of the bigger geopolitical rivalries or, conflicts around the world. And we haven't talked about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and we're in Europe and we're close. And I think it matters because of how disruptive it has been to global energy systems and to the transition in Europe with a green transition to away from fossil fuels. And we have to look at the entire global energy, economy if we're starting to talk about any type of green transition. And so I think, some of these, other conflicts that are taking place will affect, the race, to find alternatives. So I think that's something, is a concern that I think also needs to be on the table. Hope. So I am just going to end with the power of activists, working in Bolivia and seeing the communities down there in the Salar, the unions, the federations of indigenous people, they are powerful. They understand the role they are playing in the green transition. They understand the impacts on their local communities. It is impressive. And if we listen more to those on the ground, I think there is a lot of hope. And I would say this is across the board with environmental activists I know in Central Asia. They understand what is needed for a global energy transition and to ensure that they are also protected in the process.
Wow, this was really powerful messages from all the panelists, but I'm really glad, Erika, that you ended with a hopeful, like bringing out the sort of hope to the local communities. I think that was a very good end. Now we have about 25 minutes for the Q&A session. So we open up for questions or comments from the audience. So I suggest that we collect a couple of questions, perhaps 3 or 4, before we let the panelists respond to the questions. And when you ask the question, please make sure to specify if you direct it to a specific person or if it's a more general question to the entire panel. And also for the participants online, Johanna will read your question. So please be sure, don't forget to post your name and your affiliation so we can clarify that as well for the question. Okay, so let's start with the first question.
Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at KTH, so here next door. Thank you. It was incredibly insightful. I don't have a specific address, say, of the question, but it's more related to the one that I feel is a big absent in these talks, which is actually the role of investors. So I've been hearing a lot about sourcing, of course, of the critical minerals, but the processing phase is also very critical in terms of governance, especially if it's so skewed somewhere else. And some of the study that we have been doing are actually focusing on the role of investors in putting pressures on the value chain. And I wonder if that can be a powerful leverage to actually move the market toward a more responsible and ethical entire supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all panelists for very thought-provoking and interesting talks. My name is Isabella Strindeval. I'm a PhD student here at Stockholm University, Department of Political Science. My question is for Susan, because you spoke about governance gaps and accountability gaps. And I was wondering a little bit about this discord between the locus of production and the locus of control. So production is maintained mostly in the global south by global conglomerates in the global north. So where does regulation, because that's what you were alluding to, that we need regulation in order to account for these governance gaps. Where does regulation need to occur? In the home states of the mining conglomerates or within the producing states? And to whom? Because especially with every resource boom, there's small and medium enterprises that also come to the fore. And they're often not included either in the voluntary initiatives that the global mining, sort of the giants tend to join, but also not in regulation that falls on larger enterprises. So how can we properly regulate and whom can we properly regulate? Thank you.
My name is Arnur from the Embassy of Kazakhstan. I would like to thank all the panelists for engaging presentation. So many resource-rich countries now are looking to make up the value chain by developing industries that process raw material into high-value products. And Kazakhstan is also a major producer in critical raw materials, with this situating a strategic location between Asia and Europe. And so my question is, what are your recommendations would be for such countries like Kazakhstan? So they could advance in developing value-added industries, such as battery manufacturing or green hydrogen production. So within the CRM ecosystem, that is very competitive now. Thank you.
Take one more,
and then, we can take one more, and then
we switch to the online.
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Ninad. I'm a senior editor with Cell Press, which is a scientific publisher. I guess it isn't directed at Scott, but relates mostly to what Scott said. And I agree with you entirely about the consumption, demand, production side of things. But something that I didn't hear all of you directly address is different models of ownership or management that could be applied at local scales for local communities. Some of this has been discussed in terms of community-owned or managed renewable power plants. I'm wondering whether there's any discussion in that regard in terms of the production itself or processing.
Great, thank you. So now I suggest that we turn to the panelists, and perhaps you could choose one question that you feel that is most closely toward your presentation. Would you like to start, Erika?
Sure. I'll start with Kazakhstan because I spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan in my youth. And it's a country that's very dear to me from having spent many years in Kazakhstan and working on the oil and gas sector in the Caspian. And so, at that time, Kazakhstan was very much an exporting country. And what, I learned at that time was the importance of contracts and contract disclosure of what was in the contracts and different types of corporate social responsibility policies, given that there were so many large foreign companies in the early years in the different consortia. And the importance of making sure the communities are engaged and involved and understand what's happening with the industries. But as far as you're talking now, I mean, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about battery production, because I think that was something that at the time, in the oil and gas industry, that didn't happen. And there is this tremendous role, I think, for Kazakhstan to think about the entire supply chain and not just thinking about exporting the raw material, but also being, farther along the supply chain with the production of batteries. But also having to work very closely, with its neighboring states. And so thinking of, this notion of what are the supply chains, what are the export markets? But again, with all of this, just the importance at any stage of ensuring that the communities understand the impacts and are involved in also benefiting from the production, that there is job creation, that there's environmental social protections in place. And then I'll just say the other thing is, like, I've written a lot about different forms of ownership structure, and they all have different impacts. And it comes down to, state-owned enterprises are often the least transparent in many cases. And so how do you build transparency into the process, either through, different international forms of governance, or, if there's foreign, contracts with investors, how do you ensure that there's contract disclosure?
I love learning this about you, Erika.
What?
Your time in Kazakhstan. That's lovely.
I've written books about it.
I have to read the back catalogue. So I'm going to answer one question, hopefully lead to another, which is about where to regulate. And you talk about, a lot of production in the global south and ownership in the global north, but it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. Australia is the largest producer of lithium in the world. But we also are the fourth largest of rare earth elements, which we then ship to Malaysia. So we can talk about the extent to which there are problems in both the global north and south, particularly with this pressure to onshore or reshore critical minerals extraction and production. And so ideally, you'd like to see regulation across the board. And this would be through free trade agreements, through greening, international institutions like investor-state disputes, where it is no longer allowable for any form of the worst forms, I should say, of extractivism impacting on water, biodiversity, people, and so on. So you can think about trying to plug the gaps in the existing systems and trying to green them in ways that make it harder for companies, no matter where they are or their ownership structure, to actually have to demonstrate that they are meeting those requirements. So one of the ways of doing that is with investment, and starting with investment, because no matter where you are, you need funding. And so the investors really do have a significant amount of leverage in terms of prospecting, in terms of investing in some of these very long-term mining operations. And so if you can not only plug the types of agreements between states, the types of agreements between states and companies, but also between financiers and mining companies, then you would get a better way towards the types of outcomes that we want.
Probably I can start kind of sharing my kind of opinion about like the role of investors. So I also like quite curious about the role of investor in this kind of the picture. So that something I'm kind of try to kind of more explore is about like a task force on nature related financial disclosure mechanisms. So that is kind of related to the TCFD, the task force on climate related financial disclosure mechanisms. So in that sense, like these like global standards try to kind of make mining corporations behave more in a responsible way related to biodiversity. So because definitely, you know, even Chinese actors, Chinese companies also like tend to follow more market kind of enforcement mechanism because that has a direct economic beneficial impacts on their kind of shareholders, benefits and profits and so on. So I think this can function definitely in a one way, but I'm not so sure what is it really fundamental, like a, you know, kind of alternate and transformative solutions? That's something we need to more kind of study. And also like regarding Kazakhstan's case, something I want to highlight is gender aspect, something we didn't really highlight. This is also something I also want to study further, but I know that the women's rights and the women's stories and situation is not the same as like, you know, men's situation in mining communities. So I hope that in the multi-stakeholder kind of forums and such collaborative the kind of mechanism, I hope that the Kazakhstan also can provide some like solutions for kind of hearing women's voices in the mining sites. That is something I want to highlight. Thank you.
I will respond to, is it Nina? Yeah, thanks for the question. Especially thank you for the opportunity to highlight a recent publication, Odell and Bevington 2023. Please look it up. We just published an article last year comparing community relations and environmental impacts of state mining company in Chile. Codelco is the world's largest copper mining company, and private companies. We found that there are a lot of perceptual differences in the communities of what each of those different types of companies are facing or may be prone to do. In particular, there was a perception that Codelco performs worse than private companies with regard to environmental and social issues because they have the justification of being the sueldo de Chile, the wage of Chile. They bring home the bacon. They make the money for the country, so it's worth it to sacrifice some of the environment. In practice, though, we found that Codelco is very much subject to a lot of, if not all of these same pressures, not all of, but most of the same pressures that other large copper mining companies are, because mining production is a commodity. So they're based on global prices that individual companies can't really affect. And so they are under a lot of the same pressures. And in fact, these companies oftentimes do end up having similar environmental harms in communities. This idea that I shared earlier about displacement, hydrosocial displacements, we saw in all three of the case studies that we looked at. One, the public company Codelco, a foreign, international and Australian company, and a domestic Chilean company. You also had mentioned, though, other operating structures like community-owned mines. I do not know as much about that. There is a case in Chile. Albemarle is a lithium mining company that gives a certain percentage of its profits directly to Atacameño and Canantay communities in the north. I think it's like 3% of profits. There's been concern about that from a lot of people I've talked to of do the communities have the capacity to absorb that amount of money. I think, though, that also makes a lot of sense, given that these communities give up a lot of resources for this. So that's a really contested issue in Chile. I think also ripe for articles. Maybe somebody has already written it, but something that I think would be really interesting to study. And then in Alaska, of course, there are examples of community-owned or indigenous-owned operations as well. Not something I've studied, but maybe something interesting to look at. I also don't, the value chain question in Kazakhstan is not something I know about directly, but I can refer you to the case of Chile. I think it's maybe an interesting one to look at. They are working really hard at this with lithium, especially. They don't want to just be producing the lithium, but they want to produce the batteries as well. Colleague of mine, Caroline White-Knockleby, is working directly on this hydrogen and lithium in Chile. So maybe check out her work. Thanks.
Thank you. I can just make two brief remarks, perhaps in picking up on the ownership question. I haven't studied that, but just part of conversations where, especially as was said now, there are examples North America, recently Canada, about the more creative forms of community company arrangements. And of course, the concern there is about the sharing of the risks, of course, for communities as well. If you come in as a shareholder and different kinds of ownership arrangement that you're not used to, and the upstream and the steps before you arrive at a discussion around ownership is whether you actually want this project or not, and the planning process, the consent requirements. So not to forget about that before you think about the project model. That was just one thought. And second and final thought was about investment. I think it's interesting to think about, and also perhaps to sound slightly more hopeful. The impression I have is from the investor side, despite the proliferation of ESG schemes or approaches, that doesn't seem to lead to so much traction from what I hear on the community level. But when communities or indigenous federations have the capacity to actively target investors and inform them that we know what's happening, we are well equipped, we will go to court, then actually investors do listen. So that I think is helpful, and there, of course, there's leverage, but it requires that you have in the community and you have empowered actors to target the right channel, oftentimes.
Thank you. And now we will take some questions from online, and Johanna Cohen will read up the questions.
Yes, so we got two questions. The first one is by Victoria Grants, and she asked, what is the role of artisanal and small-scale mining parties when it comes to governance and accountability? How influential could they be in contributing to bigger dialogue and around more sustainable mining practices? This is the first question. And then we have a second question by Hamilton. He's a postdoc associate at MIT. And he asks, how can we involve and make substantial contribution to local people where mining is involved? For instance, local people are against lithium mining from brine and lithium triangle because of the waste supply.
Would you all briefly reflect upon those two questions? Who would like to start this time?
I mean, I'll say something just about the lithium triangle. I think it depends where you are in the lithium triangle. And, Bolivia hasn't started producing at a commercial scale. So I think it is more about, how consultation will play out to ensure that the communities benefit from the lithium mining, and that the contracts with the Chinese companies, the Russian companies that have signed contracts are very clear, and that they are done with proper consultation with the communities in the Salar.
I can speak to the role of artisanal miners. I think they're left out of the conversation, to be honest. Most of the large-scale production processes really do focus on the project area and delineate what they are responsible for. And quite often that is not the artisanal mining that is going on around the mine site. So it, in many ways, demonstrates that a lot of governance initiatives really seek to exclude being responsible for a range of other things. And they would argue that seeing as they're not part of the larger production process, that they shouldn't have to be responsible. And so I think more voices at the table could change that in terms of providing more opportunity for fairer discussions around how mining is conducted and for whom. Probably I will give you a little bit broad kind of reaction to those two questions. So I see that like a power asymmetry between like a bigger actors and smaller and weaker actors in this whole scene, like a small artisanal mining companies as well, but also like a local community actors as well. But in many cases, like we want to collaborate and want to make them engage more. But I can also see that like information kind of imbalance as well, also linked to language as well. For instance, often like mostly Western like actors are much more exposed to like rigid information and valid information. But when you speak, for instance, Mandarin or different types of language in the global South, they are quite marginalized in this international dialogue and governance kind of era as well. So I hope that like we can kind of find more kind of transnational kind of movement or collaboration way to kind of provide such kind of informations more in a justice way.
On the ASM question, I want to highlight Raphael in the audience who works on cobalt. I assume you work on ASM cobalt. Yeah, so would love to hear your thoughts on this. I won't call an audience member up, but see him after because I'm sure he has a lot to say about this. I would just reiterate, I think ASM is really important and we don't talk about it enough. And I think there is a link to the second question, which is ASM provides a lot of jobs and could provide a lot of jobs, whereas the large-scale industry is going to a lot of automation and maybe reducing a lot of jobs. So I think that's kind of an interesting balance. On that second question on the local contributions, and Hamilton, thanks for the question. He's calling in from MIT. Good to hear from you. I think the first part of that question to me is that communities want to be part of the dialogue. They don't just want a mine imposed upon them. So there's a pretty easy first part there. I mean, it's not easy, but in other words, it's perhaps obvious that communities want to be able to have a say in how the mine emerges. I do think that a lot of communities want jobs and they want training so that the labor at that mine comes from the local community and isn't shipped in from other countries or from the big cities. There's a desire for that as well. And then I think there's a need for plans for that mine. From day one, that mine should have money set aside for mine closure so that when that mine finishes up, the community is not left holding the bag of a tailings dam and all sorts of other environmental harms, or a mine that the company cannot afford to shut down and so leaves a skeleton crew on board and operates at a loss and just leaves a nasty mine there forever. Yeah, stop there.
Thanks. I'll take the liberty to interpret the question in a broader sense about the benefits locally and Christian jobs. In Sweden, certainly, but also from my experience in Southeast Asia, I think there is often this sort of presumption that there's a lack of job opportunities, lack of alternatives, whereas often it's the case that there's a lack of government strategy to provide alternatives, provide job opportunities. And in the forests in Southeast Asia, there are ways to develop the economy. It doesn't include extraction. In Sweden, the Sami people have very functional sort of ways of reconciling the needs for economic development and sustainable land use, but the national government does not have a very active or absent strategy how to develop reindeer herding, fishing and hunting. So I mean, a little bit in the sense of thinking about how much minerals do we need. We can also think about starting the other end of the plan land use. I mean, what could the other way of using the land be that could enable sustainable development for the people in the place?
Thank you. And I think that was actually the final words, Rasmus. And I think that was a very good conclusion of this seminar that has given us so much food for thought. And I hope that you would like to continue the discussions because we have a little mingle session after this with some finger foods and some drinks that are hopefully there in the back. So please stay with us for about half an hour and continue the discussion with the panelists. Thank you so much for everyone that joined, and thank you so much for the time.